All right, so I'm officially recording. This is the first time I've recorded things on Zoom. So welcome to the Inclusive Activist Podcast. I'm very excited to have my friends from Indigenous Vision here today. I've got Souta calling last and Tyler Walls. And today we're gonna be talking about colonization and unpacking colonization and what is colonization and how does it work and how does it hurt us? How have we been enculturated into colonization and what ways does that hurt general people and how does that hurt us as individuals. But I would be remiss if we didn't first kind of just allow each other to introduce ourselves in our own words. And then after we introduce ourselves, I think it's really important that we all kind of take a second to check in with what happened at the Capitol 2 days ago, because that was personally very traumatic for me. And I've been on kind of a social media radio silence with that. And this is the first time I'm really emerging to speak about those things. But we'll start with introductions. My audience already knows me, so I don't need to talk to about myself a little bit more. Let's start with Souta, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself.
Yes, thank you for having me. It's such an honor to be on Inclusive Activism podcast. So my name's Souta calling last. Hello, everybody. I am Blackfeet in blood. I hail from the Montana and the Alberta prairies, and I am currently on Salish territory in Missoula, Montana. But if I peek out my window, I can see my own, so it's not too far. Glad to
Any
be
other
here.
thing that you want to tell us so like they kind of get to know you and your background?
Yeah, that's important. Melissa is an excellent editor on our podcast. My background is in environmental sciences, and so I'm trained as a water resource specialist. My specialty in that is mining contamination and cleanup, and that's really guided what I call the foundation project of Indigenous Vision, which is the environmental justice and social justice mapping project. And yeah, check it out, indigenousvision.org, IV Maps.
Yeah, CEO of not 501c3 nonprofit woman, Indigenous CEO. Like there's probably like 7 in the world. And here's one of them. Really excited to have her with us here today. Tyler, would you want to go ahead and introduce yourself to us?
Yes, of course. Lolo ma, hello, nyawe, skina. It's good to be here, everybody. I am happy to kick off 2021 with you, Rowdy, and Souta, and all your guests here that are listening. I am Tyler Walls. I grew up in Central Arizona in the Verde Valley. I am a graduate of the American Indian Studies program at Arizona State University. And so I got a lot of great foundation from my professors there. I myself grew up off the reservation, 3rd generation. My grandma and my grandfather were the ones who were originally removed through the boarding school process in the 50s. And then in the 60s, they were relocated on BIA assignment, BIA being the Bureau of Indian Affairs. I am project director for Indigenous Vision and also culture humility trainer. And we unpack quite a lot with culture humility, and it's what we do. And I think throughout today's discussion, we'll be sprinkling that in. I'm Hopi, and I'm also Onondaga. And I'm even more greater dynamic than that. My father's white. And so I bring this racial understanding of who I am as an identity, mixed race person, and still very much learning about colonization. And I look forward to offering insight, but more so for us to wrap our heads around it collectively and moving forward for all of us to come to understand it, because it's a complicated beast.
Absolutely. And speaking of colonization and the harmful effects of colonization, I think there's no greater example of the harm that can happen with colonization than what happened on December 6th. And like I said, personally, I found that to be something that was really traumatic and just hard to watch and hard to see, given, because locally, I try to support Black Lives Matter as much with stuff. As you both know, Indigenous people are actually the racial group killed most often at the highest rate. And seeing the lack of response, the complicity of police officers, like removing barriers, taking selfies with people. I wanted to just check in and get reflections from you both. Like, how are you? Because I think we'd be non-Indigenous not to check on, you know, my aunties and uncles in this moment. Either you want to go first?
Tyler, I feel like I've got to process it. Being able to speak with Melissa, we were on the phone with each other right away, and just kind of, we thought that it wasn't that shocking. What was shocking was the continued proof that things are not equal, and it's so blatant. And so it's expected, you know. You can't go through violent colonization practices, and you can't implement discriminatory racist policies without some sort of backlash. And I think the people at the Capitol yesterday were not the right kind of backlash. we kind of, you know, she says she falls back on self-care and personal empowerment. I fall back on culture and teachings that, you know, all of us are at our own place in development, and that's like, maybe, you know, the soul, if you believe in that. Our emotional intelligence is all, we're all growing at different paces, and I feel like that's the only way. And I'm still trying to take that same teaching of being accepting of different people's growth cycles, but there's still a point where your stupidity hurts other people. So it's very hurtful right now. And I think it's all bubbled to the surface. And I think it's a great display of what Indigenous people, you know, the opposite. There were only 15 arrests, you know, just this morning. Wet'suwet'en popped up on my timeline. I shared their pipeline blockade in BC, and there were 15 arrests just on one day, and there were only 25 people in the crowd. So they arrested more than half the people that showed up at that protest to protect drinking water. Yeah. So, Tyler.
Yeah, this is awesome because
I'm still shaking my head. I'm still, yeah.
Yeah, I haven't externally processed it with other folks yet. You know, I've internalized it. I like to think I understand what the heck's going on, that it was coming, you know, especially when the leader of that group of people is calling on that particular crowd to do that. It's scary. And I've been to the Capitol many times, you know, a handful of times. I've been in the halls of Congress, both Senate and House of Representatives. And how the heck they got through that security checkpoint is beyond me, because it's heavily guarded. I mean, it's a fortress. It's a fortified buildings that prevent people from going in with, you know, heavy militarized police. And for only one person to get killed, I think it was 4. And of course, we don't want any lives lost, but understanding if you're going to do that, the situation presents itself for somebody to get hurt. How others didn't get hurt is beyond me, and how they were able to go into the halls, the Senate floor, and act foolish, you know, because I do believe in the sacredness of democracy. Being a Haudenosaunee Onondaga person, democracy is deeply rooted in the values of who I am individually, not just part of me as the nation of Onondaga, me so much as a descendant of the treaty ancestors who signed the 1794 Treaty of Ganandagan, right? And so the democracy standpoint of how that was allowed is beyond me. But I think it's very clear why it's allowed, and we have to identify privilege and power in this conversation, because that's exactly what they had. Privilege being the white privilege that presented itself, not being shot down right away. When we look at some of the indigenous protests and occupation movements, it's been heavily responded with militarized police and force. And I, for one, am interested to see how it plays out continuing, as far as the accountability of who is going to be held accountable. You know, there's talks about invoking the 25th Amendment upon our president, which to me is wow, fascinating to see this all play out. It's scary. The scary part is seeing images of white supremacy. One image that I saved for my record for discussion points was the picture in front of the Capitol with the crowd. They put up they built a structure that symbolizes their movement, which was a noose, a rope hanging, which just frightens me, gives me chills throughout my body, knowing that that is the symbolization of what they want to portray. What does that mean? You know, historically, it's meant to kill Black people, right? And also Indigenous people.
Yeah, we were just talking about how every state, even Missoula, the town we're in right now, has right in the inception of the town, they hung 4 Salish natives. And so and then the Dakota 38, it's not, why would you choose a noose? Because I think it's fueled by hate.
Yeah, that instance that Souta is talking about that happened in the city of Missoula, we're researching it more. And Salish Kootenai College came out with a book highlighting this instance and what it involved. That it involved 4 natives being hung for the same crime that a group of white settlers committed. The same crime. 4 natives got hung, while the white settlers never were held responsible for the same crimes, right? And so someone gets free and someone gets hung. You know, and we go back to that rushing of the Capitol. There's a reason why not that many people were gunned down.
How is it? It's just, it blows my mind, guys, to think about how protecting water and protesting a pipeline, many states have already made laws that it's an act of domestic terrorism. It's in the books. You can be charged as a domestic terrorist. How is it not an act of domestic terrorism to hang up a Confederate flag in our
symbol of treason? The one thing that we know is for sure anti-American is the Confederate flag, because it was like built to be anti-American. I think what I felt I saw, you know, like it's funny because they have that "Don't Tread on Me" with the snake, like they love that thing, right? I think I saw the beginning of the snake starting to eat its tail finally. In that, when they got in, it's not like all those people that went in know who's the Republicans and who's the Democrats, right? And when they broke in, I was like, oh my God, I hope like Nancy Pelosi or like AOC or Ilhan Omar get out, because I know if they get caught, they're going to get serially raped. They'll probably be tortured. They'll probably be killed. But I think what I don't know that some of the Republicans have processed is, if you're a Republican from Idaho, I don't know if they know who you are. Like, I think had they caught that person, they could have done the same things to them. And then you'd be like, well, like, they were in such a fervor. It didn't matter, because the same police officers that removed barriers to allow them in, they were getting beat up too. Like, I saw this ridiculous video of people in a hallway and they're just pepper spraying each other back and forth. And there's this guy, and this one kind of made me laugh. He's like, are we gonna go? I can't even see what's going on, man. Are we gonna get in there? And I'm like, where are you going if you can't see where you're going anyway? And why are you in such a hurry to get there? But I don't know that they've really processed. They weren't just coming for the perceived, like, us. They were coming for anyone that was in the way. And this is the beginning of that circle of the snake eating its tail. And that's why I think it's such a great example of what colonization does. Like the examples that you've given with the gallows and the noose. But for me, it always has to turn at some point. And this is a movement fomented by a group of people to exploit that anger and hurt that finally began to turn on itself, because the police officers that let them in, one of those officers died. Like one of the first person to die was a lady, QAnon Trump supporter lady from San Diego. She got shot and killed because she was one of the first people through. There was some collusion between police and these folks. And I've seen the video of it, and I'm not a big conspiracy person, but when I see the video evidence, I'm aware. But I think now police got to look at, like, well, they attacked us too. Like, what side are we on? Who are we supporting here? But I want to thank you for, like, checking in and being vulnerable and talking about some of that stuff.
Yeah.
Because I think that's how I saw it. It was like the beginning of colonization. So with that being said, since this is supposed to be about colonization, how do, in your own words, and I'd like to hear from both of you, how do you describe colonization to others? Like, what is that? How does it work? And, like, if you were to give a synopsis of that idea to someone that's like, I don't get this and I don't understand what's the big deal. What is colonization?
That is a great, complex, dynamic, explosive question that does need to get addressed, and we need to wrap our heads around this. I've been thinking about that, and it's unpackaging 500 years since Columbus was lost. And
well, one thing I would say, Tyler, is it's before that, because white people got colonized too. And, like, there's a notion that white people didn't go through a colonization process. Those folks got colonized just like everybody else. But I'll let you.
Colonization in terms of geography, absolutely. Geography of this North American continent in regards to European colonization started in 1492. Yes, there's a great author, John Mohawk, who was a social studies person, and he studied the history of conquest, and he rooted it all the way back to the foundings of, the Greek and the mythical ages of that time, and the conquest of people, on conquest of people, and conquest of land, and conquest of bodies, and conquest of resources have been continuing for a very long time. And so when we look at colonization, we do have to look at it in very different dynamic ways. I present a perspective from my own lens, which is different from yours and Souta's. And that's the great thing about it, is we then bundle our minds together to process what it means for all of us. But genocide comes to mind. When we look at it in terms of indigenous lands here in America, disposition of land is a huge part of colonization when we look at it in the settling of the West, of the Western states, of how colonization paved way for where we are today in Missoula, where we are today in the Phoenix Valley. And so that root history that got us here today is a bloody one. And it's a painful one. And people have suffered at the expense of others, and others being the United States government and the people in charge that benefit from the conquest of indigenous lands, the colonization of indigenous lands. And so, yeah, I'll stop there because I could just go on another 20-minute debriefer in my own opinion.
The longhouse conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, we need months and months and months.
That one's safe for the all-night smoke. So I think my idea of colonization was really influenced at a time in my life where I was deep into the study of water molecules, and I was looking into different decontamination methods. And so one of the ones I stumbled across that was like a state-of-the-art type pilot project type thing was the use of vibrant frequencies and vibration to separate water molecules from contamination. And if you hit the water with a certain frequency, then the water molecules will isolate themselves from a contaminant automatically. And so then that naturally went into looking at, I've always been interested in Indigenous people, my own Indigenous people's relationship to water, and more so water as a resource needed for life, but also water as a relationship with other beings. We call them Souta in Blackfoot, the water people. And so my idea of colonization was really, I guess I was just starting to hear about that and starting to learn about it. And then I had lots of examples from my past where it was really easy for me to pick out instances of direct colonization. So the reservation implementation, needing a permission slip from the Indian agent to leave the reservation, having hunting weapons taken away and given rations, change in food systems, like abrupt halt and change in food systems, and all of the violence and transition that takes. Like, how hard has it been for us to adopt masks, right? So like you take a native who's used to lots of space and then you confine them within a fence and say you can't leave unless the Indian agent gives you permission to, and if you do, you'll be shot on sight. So I always have equated reservations to concentration camps, and we're still having this like parental government over us when we are full-blown independent nations and people. But back to the water and colonization and how that in fact impacted my view is that I really started to see colonization through the lens of what's happening inside of us as beings that are influenced by energy. We're influenced by words, we're influenced by our environment. So in environmental health sciences, we know that the conditions and the quality of your environment, the zip code you live in, all of that has the ability to turn on genetic factors for you. So different genes are activated by your environmental conditions. So in this state of colonization, our body and our molecules are impacted by colonization, because what colonization brings with it is a hierarchical system that's held in place by violence and hoarding of resources. And so there's the haves and the have-nots, and it's kept in place by these scripts and these narratives that we learn. And so colonization is in those scripts that we try to disrupt and break in our cultural humility trainings. And that leads to the social transformation or the decolonization that we need, because what it does is it makes us critically think about the words we use to describe ourselves, the words other people are using to describe themselves, the words we use to describe our processes, the energy imbued in those terms. Is it a resistance? Are we working for something? Is it colonization? Is it decolonization? Or are we indigenizing? So it's really more so what my water research has taught me is that colonization is a form of violence that is just like water. It has a solid, a liquid, and a gas, and those all impact us in different ways. And so colonization in terms of policy making and terminology and the way we treat other people who are less educated, in a lower, like less economically abundant, different classes, like all of that is violence that we keep in place with the terminology that we have in place right now. And everything down to the water molecules in our body are impacted by it. That's a really long answer. I have a whole hour presentation on it.
If I can, Rowdy, I want to bounce off of what she said, because that was great. I really enjoyed that small breakdown, Souta. You made me think of how we could go about breaking down colonization even further. And it's about narrative and what we've been fed, perspective, because if you ask a native, colonization is horrible, bad, because we've experienced it on the short end of the stick, so to speak. But those that have benefited from colonization and have been fed a narrative of it being a beautiful, enlightened, romanticized thing, and to put it in even legal perspective, it was justified through manifestation in the doctrine of discovery, which I call doctrine of domination. And it's through the church system that brought European powers, and we can still see this church system in place through our democracy today, with there is no separation between church and state in this country. Let's be very real. Look at our dollar bill, "In God we trust," right? And so it's justified through the actions of manifest destiny, that it was God-given right to colonize unchristian lands across the world, not just here in the Americas. And one of the greatest colonizers, and so here we are now having the need to break down the difference between colonizer versus colonized. Who is the colonizer versus who is being colonized? Great Britain, in my perspective, is one of the elite power holders of colonization throughout the world. Excellent. You look at the Commonwealth of Great Britain, Australia, Canada, the islands, Africa, India. It gives me chills, the amount of oppression and colonization of over indigenous peoples, in their eyes, unchristian. And sorry if I get animated, because this is deep, deep stuff. Mm-hmm. And indigenous peoples, we've been colonized to a degree over our minds, over our bodies. And so colonization over people, colonization of our lands that we depend on for health of our physical and spiritual beings, and then colonization of our culture, as Souta touched on, the removal of our language, removal of our clothing, our regalia, removal of how we go about being indigenous, Onondaga, Hopi. And when we unpackage colonization today, it's still very much alive, because we are continuing to be assimilated at a very quick, fast, rapid pace. We look at language. our language systems are on the brink of extinction, and some have lost its complete language system with elders dying out. And I think we lose a indigenous language every day in the world. You know, there's 3,000 indigenous groups, I believe, across the world, and we're losing a language all the time. Onondaga, I'm told there's like 5 language speakers left back in Onondaga. Seneca, maybe 12. And I had a cousin that said, realistically, cut that number in half. We may have, you know, half of that. Yeah. You know, in Hopi, it's a little more isolated in terms of colonization. So you look at geography too. Back east, Onondaga, we've been impacted by colonization really since the early 1600s, late 1500s, when those first ships landed on the eastern shoreboard, and meeting those eastern natives. You know, Onondaga, we were right there. And in terms of Hopi, you know, we were colonized and attempted from the south, from the Spanish crown. And so we started seeing the Spanish occupation of our lands in the Southwest as early as the 1500s. And of course, they never conquered us entirely because we are still there. And then fast forward until the 1850s, that's when Western settlement started coming into our lands, Western settlement from the United States perspective. And so geography, there's similarities and commonalities throughout where this took place all over the world. And the similarities are bloodshed, pain, and yes, you know, there's always those folks that say, can't you get over it?
Oh,
Souta, do you want to answer that?
I love to counter the argument of, well, if you want to decolonize, turn off your lights and quit driving your car. I love answering this question. So going back to my water research and us at deeper, a sense of us at deeper beings, us as human beings at a deeper level, colonization is in our choices now. So we have the ability to do everything kinder or decolonized. We have the ability to buy local, to help our neighbor instead of some industry in another country. We have the ability to generate our electricity in a much kinder, earth-friendly way that's not going to cause harm and violence to the environment that it's being brought up from. We have the technology and the ability to transition every car in the world over to something friendlier. And I keep saying, and I'm going to put it on this podcast too, the first millionaire to buy Jiffy Lube or Midas out and make those into transition garages where we're still able to get our tire changed, but I can pay $5,000 to get my truck turned over to vegetable oil or put a battery in there with some regenerative braking. I'd pay $6,000 to keep the skeleton of my truck and just have it transition. And so investors out there, idea
makers, the $1 million idea, right?
Yes, please make a transition garage at the scale that that's reachable and accessible for the everyday person when they need to buy a new vehicle, that we are transitioning to less violent, kinder ways to be, which are inherently decolonized activities, I think. So it's just being kind.
To synthesize kind of what I've heard from you, because I've been thinking about this for a long time too, and I find the more you can distill something down to an essence, the better it's understood. And so when I try to describe colonization, it's violence, and violence, to really describe violence, it's harm. Spiritual harm, emotional harm, physical harm, bodily harm, right? It's all that harm. It's marginalization, right? It's the idea that I'm better than anything else. That's a big key component of colonization. And then the last one is exploitation, right? It's I'm better, I can use, I can take, I can exploit. And I think that's why indigenous folks have always done water better, because water had a sentience. Water was a being. Like animals had sentience, plants have sentience, wind has sentience, air has sentience, land has sentience. We've been in relation, right? And if you're truly in relation and in balance with all things, you can't exploit anything, right? And so when they say turn off your lights, go outside, well, you know, like my partner and I saved up and we've got solar panels, and it's expensive, but it's a big thing that you can do to start living that balance better. And I think you've given some great examples, because some of the questions I had were how are oppressed groups hurt by colonization. I heard a lot of wonderful answers in that. And you've also started, like, one of the things I'm starting to explore is like how the privileged folks who think they're benefiting from colonization are also hurt too. That's why I like that analogy of the snake is beginning to eat its own tail. I think white people, not all white people, of course, but like the white people that believe in and double down on colonization, they're really sick. Like, and it's a sickness of disconnection. It's a sickness of I-ism, a belief in myself, a belief that, you know, if I have enough money, I'll be fine, which is not true. But it's so lonely, that thinking. And I love the way that y'all come at the world, because when you talk about scripts, I'm a communication person. Like for me, it's the spells that we bring things into being, either in colonization being or indigenization being. Like, how do we talk about things? You're how Souta, how you talk about the water, like the vibration of water. Like those are the songs, right? Those are the singing. Like that's the example of like things vibrate into wholeness, or they vibrate into decay. And then Tyler, when you bring in the land and the lines and, you know, who belongs where and like who doesn't belong in other spaces, I think it's really amazing, like thinking of you all and what you do. Given our time frame of what we got with for this podcast, I want to ask this question as the last question, because I think when people see us as Native people, they think we don't do colonization, that we don't perpetuate it, and that is a sad untruth, because we've been poisoned by it. So I want to hear about how you've been poisoned, like hurt, but then also where is a space where you're attempting to stop your perpetuation of your colonization scripts that you've been written with. And I know that's a hard question to ask, and if you need me to go first so you have some time to think, I'd be willing to.
It's a hard question, but
It is a hard question.
I feel like colonization has hurt me the most in talking about my crystals, my crystals, my molecules, and the crystalline structures that they can make or not make. I've been hurt by words. You know, they say sticks and stones may break your bones, but words will never hurt. But words carry energy, and they can alter the way your water molecules in your body sit, and that affects you as an individual to your very core, I think. And so I've been called a SQUA squaw. You could beep that out, please. I'm trying to create a trend of beeping it out, but I've been hurt by being called those words and then having to defend myself against that word, as if my experience is not justified enough in my feelings. And the way I've responded is I don't want to be victimized by it. And so everything I do is like a form of self-defense, essentially. We've got actual self-defense. So one of our programs that we help communities with is missing murdered Indigenous women and a self-defense instructor. And if you need an agenda and facilitation materials, we send it to you for free. And then we also try to help the community pay for the instructor. And so literal self-defense, and then more of like emotional self-defense. And I think cultural humility, the more I learn from the people who participate, it just helps my own emotional maturity level and my ability to handle things and know that they are happening everywhere, which drives me and fuels me more for doing like the injustice map and creating a picture, a national picture of what's going on and the extent of how bad it is and where it's bad at. And so I tend to not stay in the victim position very long when I've been oppressed. And I tend to move into an action, which is funneled through my organization in literal self-defense, cultural humility, emotional self-defense, even with my fellow Indigenous Organizers Coalition here in Montana, we're going to be talking about like surveillance and online self-defense. And so, you know, the best way to be prepared for anything, any risk out there or any potential oppression is to be prepared for it and be emotionally ready. And for me, I'm ready to defend myself physically if I have to. And the cool thing is that it all takes situational awareness, whether it's something physical that's happening or just words being exchanged in a workplace. Like it's all situational awareness and our ability to key in on that and then help our friends through it ourselves.
Yeah, I think when you talk about like sexual assault prevention, I think Tyler, like in the future, someday, we need to look at what can we do to teach men how to not do these things first and foremost, right? Because like to ask women to defend themselves doesn't really look at where the problem is. The problem is with men because 99.87% of all violence happens men to other human. And so I think if we could do men's rape prevention, this is the thing that's really like deeply needed too. Tyler, how about you? Like, how are you affected? And then how do you also perpetuate colonial thinking sometimes too?
Yeah, impacted, I'm affected. Being a man, I deal admittedly with anger. I struggle with anger, and I bless Souta for helping me work through that because I wasn't shown a really good avenue to be a polite, kind man. And I think that has to do with the intergenerational trauma that is trickled down through the colonization of our bodies, because we were healthy men at one point. You know, we had healthy minds, we had healthy bodies, we were healthy people. Yeah, we weren't a perfect society as Indigenous nations prior to colonization. We had our own issues, but we understood behavioral health very well in regards to psychology, and we had unbelievable Indigenous medicine and scientists that understood the complexities of mind, body, and spirit. You know, some of the things that scientists are barely learning today, we knew this. But through the process of 500 years of colonization here in the Americas, we've lost a lot. We lost a lot of that knowledge. We lost a lot of that understanding to be healthy, to take care of ourselves, to self-care. We lost disconnection, or we've disconnected ourselves to our communities. And it was planned. It's not necessarily our fault. So don't blame yourself for being disconnected from your community if you are a native that doesn't know your history in regards to your relations. Because of the federal Indian policies that still play out today in 2021, the policies are meant to assimilate us into this melting pot of America and really disappear any indigenousness that we hold on to. You know, you look at the boarding school process, it was meant to strip us from anything there was to be in regards to being Indian. And I wanted to touch on your synthesis of our colonization, what we offered, Rowdy, and you said violence and harm. I would add in there the roots of colonization are racist at very best. They're racist ideologies of superiority over another people,
Mhm.
inferiority of thinking that that person is less and it's okay to take,
Mhm.
and to rape and pilgrimage. And, you know, when we started off this conversation of looking at the capital over, you know, the overtaking of the capital, it made me think of the massacres that took place in our homelands throughout the centuries of the settling of our lands. You know, we've had massacre after massacre, and I come from a survivor of a grandmother who survived the Clinton Sullivan massacre of 1779 that was ordered by George Washington himself. Souta comes from culture that had its own Baker massacres. You know, they're known as the Marias massacres, and the different massacres that took place in the Southwest. We have Yavapai massacres that really just did harmful, damaging things to us and are perpetuated intergenerational because of the unawareness that it even took place.
Mhm.
Even us as Native people don't know that this took place because we're not taught it. And so when we think about how we're perpetuating this as people, well, we're not talking about it. And silency is a killer. Complacency is a killer. And so it made me think, like, you never go into colonization through your K through 12 curriculum. It's seen as Western settlement. It's not seen as colonization. You know, you don't learn about colonization as a young adolescent person. You know, it takes additional education and reading. And some of the most powerful professors that taught me and elders, but also some of the great writers of the day, you know, have passed on this message that education is power, and so we need to be educated. I think there's a saying, you know, out there: the government is scared of an educated Indian, you know, and they better be, because it's our right to become educated as best as we can. I think if you look at some of the intergenerational situations where elders knew that we had to become educated within this Western society, white society, but there's also that understanding that we need to return that knowledge and to help benefit our communities that have been faced with obstacles that are beyond imagination because of this new forced lifestyle that we have to live. And we can't get over this that quickly. Why? Because we look at our grandparents. My grandma is still alive today. I'm very blessed. She's 82 years old, and she comes from an era of 1939. You know, and she tells me her stories of being 5 years old, remembering her grandma who survived Carlisle Indian School, right? And so it's not that far removed. And Sita, you can piggyback off this one, because Blackfeet, you guys were pretty free. You know, you guys were pretty, you know, badass on the plains up until the late 1800s. And so the colonization in Blackfeet is just over 100 years removed from reservation settlement and reservation beginnings. So
Real quick, I want to hop in just because we're coming close to the end of our colonization podcast here. But I also wanted to self-disclose, for me, how I still practice my colonial thinking is in my practice of whiteness. People like to listen to me because I do whiteness really well. And whiteness is colonial thinking, and it's respectability politics, and it's looking a certain way and sounding a certain way and talking a certain way. And it's hard because, like, I'm rewarded in society for my performance of whiteness, which is also the great pain of my life, in that I'm one of those Native folks that never had a connection to their people, right? You know, like, I've learned about indigeneity through pan-Indianism and also study of indigenous people across the world. But I think what's nice about my pain is everybody, I think like native people of North America are blessed in that they have such close connections to their peoplehood and their identities. Like I think of the Maori people in New Zealand, they still have those systems. I think of the Aboriginal people in Australia, there's some of the few folks that still have some of those connections. But the pain is we're disconnected from our indigeneity. And I think white people want to be Indian so bad because they've lost their connection to their own indigeneity. And I'm like, Gaelic people, Gallic people, those were the indigenous druidic people that had those things. Like, go research those folks. Don't be Indian. You can't be Indian. Like, go be you, like, and the people that you once came from. But that's why I wanted to have you here, because you're Indigenous Vision, and this is kind of like what you're hoping to bring to the world. So I'd like to get from you like contact information, like how could they follow you, both your podcast, your 501c3, and connect and help with some of those things.
Thank you so much, Rowdy. Please follow us on Facebook at Indigenous Vision, on Instagram at Hello Ivy Music, on SoundCloud /Indigenous Vision. Our website is indigenousvision.org. You can forward any questions, embarrassing questions. I answer all questions. I love them at for my Ask an Indian podcast at info@indigenousvision.org. No question is a silly question. If it is, I'll laugh. Thank you. But Rowdy, you said something that I wanted to follow up on, and I'm losing it. So you, okay, we'll save it for another one. Okay.
Maybe you'll get something. I have a quick closing too. Rowdy and Siti may think one of the things that we could all do, and what we offer at Indigenous Vision is cultural humility trainings. Our next one is January 26th. Please sign up. It's in the afternoon from 2 to 4. You can learn more at indigenousvision.org. And through culture humility, we're able to move towards a path of equity and social transformation. And a lot of it is unpacking what we just discussed. And so please follow us. Another cool podcast that Souta and Melissa will be doing here shortly is piggybacking what you just said, Rowdy. The topic is going to be plastic Indianism. And how there's a lot of people playing Indian and the damaging aspects of playing Indian. And so please tune in to Melissa and Souta. They're going to have a good old time identifying the harmful yet humoristic aspects of this.
Well, and don't worry, because this is just podcast 1 of 2. Right? This was really the problem. And we're going to dive into indigeneity, indigenization into our next podcast. But I only upload like a certain amount of time at a time because I think like people can digest those in that way. So I want to thank both Souta and Tyler for being here today. If you want to get a hold of me, you can do it at inclusiveactivism@cox.net. If you want to get a hold of Tyler and Souta, if you go on to indigenousvision.org. Yeah. There's contact information to get a hold of them, hire them, help them and spread indigeneity in all spaces. These are wonderful indigenous geniuses. I can't remember how to say it.
Yeah, you got it.
I've seen it written, but I haven't pronounced saying it.
That's what it was before we leave, guys. Rowdy, you brought up how everybody is indigenous from somewhere. Mm-hmm. And my water research was so amazing when I got into the European pagan cultures before they were stomped out by colonization. And so every culture, Scottish, Irish, there's so many, like I swear Indigenous people had to have known each other because we have the same water spirits. How do we have the same water spirits around the world? And so we have more in common, and I don't think anyone needs to be stealing anybody's culture because it's all rooted back in who we are as individuals. So, and
we need them to know their indigeneity, because like us comparing and talking about that indigeneity is going to be the thing that heals this world, unless the earth decides she doesn't want to play with us anymore. Like we're in a decision point. And so I think we need to learn and speak that indigeneity. So next podcast, we're going to talk about indigeneity specifically, healing, helping, becoming more whole. So with that, thank you for listening. Thank you for your eyes or your ears or however you tuned into this. And this is just part 1 of 2 with Tyler and Souta. Thank you so much for being here and tuning in with us today.